So today's sermon is a continuation of what was spoken of last time. It's part 2 of the sermon that I put, God meant it for good. God meant it for good. And so just kind of the overview of where we're at in the story of Joseph is he is before Pharaoh. He has finally been called. He is standing before Pharaoh. He interprets the dream that Pharaoh had, and not only that, but gives a solution to his interpretation, to the troubles that are coming. And so he rose from being a lowly prisoner that had to be washed and dressed to even stand before Pharaoh, to becoming second in command in Egypt. That's a huge promotion, going from the lowest of the low to the highest spot that you can possibly get to without being Pharaoh himself. And so today is the conclusion of this story. Now, what I want you to see in the story of Joseph is that he really, really had a hard life. If you look at the story from Joseph's point of view, his life is so unfair. It sucks. His father loved him. Yeah, he had parental love, but his mother died when he was young. His mother died birthing his younger brother, Benjamin, and so he grew up mostly without a mother. And even though his father loved him, it doesn't mean that his home life was good and stable. He had 11 other brothers. And 10 of those brothers hated him, could not speak peaceably to him. And because of his father's favor, what could have been a great familial relationship turned to one of absolute hatred and rejection and betrayal. Because his brothers hated him so much, they decided, hey, let's kill him. But they didn't go through and kill him. Instead, they sold him as a slave. That's, in some ways, that's even worse, because now you have to live as a slave. Their jealousy and their hatred, and understand, we're looking at this from Joseph's point of view. He hasn't been rebellious. It's not like he is intentionally rubbing it in front of his brothers. He's a good son. He obeys his father. But he's a teenager. And think about how socially aware of you when you were a teenager. How many times have you put your foot in your mouth when you're a teenager? Read the social cues wrong and said something to make the situation worse? How many times have you done that? So in this family where all this hatred is aimed at him, he tells his brothers of the dreams that God has given him, about all the sheaves of wheat bowing down to him, the sun and the moon also bowing down to him, elevating himself above them. And so they hated him all the more. Doesn't mean that what he did was per se wrong. But this favoritism led him to being sold into slavery. And from the slavers, he's sold to Potiphar, who is in command of the soldiers. And there, what does Joseph do? Instead of just lamenting his lot in life, giving up on life, he works hard. He works hard. He dedicates himself to his job, and he is elevated in the sight of his master, and everything is entrusted into him. He works hard, and he does well. He's honest, right? He's honest, and he's good looking. Another reason his brothers probably hated him so much, he's even good looking. And because he's such a handsome young man, Potiphar's wife says to him, lie with me. But he has his integrity. He keeps his integrity. He's honest. He rejects it. And what does his honesty and his goodness get him? Prison. He's good. He's honest. He is good to his master. He is faithful to his master. And what does that get him? Prison. So from a slave into prison he goes. But even in prison, he doesn't give up on life. Even there he works hard. Even there he's industrious. And so the prison guard puts him in charge of all the other things in the prison. So even though he is a prisoner himself, he still oversees all the happenings in the prison. But despite that, he's no longer a son, a favorite son of his father. He went from being like a wealthy son to a slave who is in prison. And all that because he was doing what he ought to do, what was good in the eyes of God. How unfair is his life? He was 17 years old when he was sold. 17, it's like the height of life, your early 20s. He is brought to Pharaoh when he was 30 years old. So the best years, the youngest, when you're the most handsome and energetic, that time of his life is spent as a slave and then in prison. How fair is that to him? It's unfair. His life sucks. And while he was in prison, he even helps the other prisoners. He interprets dreams for them. Remember, the baker had a dream, and the cupbearer also had a dream, and he interprets that correctly. And what does that get him? Nothing. They forget about him. Well, one dies. Can't remember him. He's dead. But the cupbearer lives and forgets about him. And it's only 2 years later, 2 years later, that the cupbearer remembers, oh yeah, that guy Joseph, he interprets dreams. If we want something, if we're in trouble, if we're suffering, a week is too long. Can you imagine 2 years? But Joseph wasn't bitter. Why wasn't he bitter about this? Why didn't he turn into a crotchety old man, just bitter, running on spite? I'm not saying that he was perfect. I'm not saying that he didn't hold anger and resentment against his brothers, because he did. You can see it. He did. And he was so terribly hurt. But why did he not turn into a bitter person who made other people's lives miserable? Because, and this is really important, he knew that there was a purpose. He didn't know this at first, but he came to understand that there was a reason that he was here. That there was a reason that God had sold him into Egypt. That God had, made him a steward of all of these things. So he gained experience and knowledge. He came to understand that there was a purpose. And how he came to that knowledge is because God continued to bless everything he touched. Whatever he touched, God blessed in a supernatural manner. Not just a little bit hard work and effort, but people noticed that whatever he did, it was so abundant and so plentiful and so blessed that this isn't just something that a man could do, but he had the favor of a God. But Joseph also didn't keep silent. He said, I worship the God of my fathers, of my forefathers, and he is blessing me. So, when it was time, when his time had been fulfilled, when God deemed it was time, God sent a dream to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh needed someone to interpret this dream. And this was the time when the cupbearer finally remembered Joseph, when Joseph was called before Pharaoh, and Joseph says to Pharaoh, interpretations are not up to men. This is up to God. It's God who sent this dream. Everything is in God's hands. I can interpret what God means to you, what God means to tell you, and he does. But not only that, he gives the solution, right? He interprets the dream this way. There will be 7 years of great abundance, of harvest, of plenty, and then 7 years of devastating famine. And so he says, appoint someone to oversee all of these. Make everyone pay 1/5 and store whatever foods that they can, 1/5 of all the grain that is produced, so that in the 7 years of famine, they can use what they stored up. And this pleased Pharaoh and pleased everyone else who heard it. And so Pharaoh, seeing that this was no ordinary man, but this was a man who had the favor of God and also the wisdom that God put in him, raised him up in that instant to be over everything in Egypt. You know, the wording that Pharaoh uses is very important. He says, over even his own house. The only thing that Joseph doesn't have under his command is Pharaoh himself. That's really high. So he came from sleeping in a prison cell to sleeping in a palace in the span of 1 day. And Joseph is now understanding, oh, so this is why I suffered. So this is why I had to endure all these years, the best years of my life, captive. It's because God wanted to put me here in this place at this exact moment so that thousands and millions of people would be saved. Do you understand that God created the world? Like if you believe in Genesis, if you believe in Jesus, you have to believe in Genesis. If God created the world, then you have to understand that God created you. And if you know that God created you, you have to understand that God also knows all of your weaknesses, but he also knows all of your strengths. God doesn't just abandon you to your troubles. God gives you training. He gives you the ability, he gives you the resources to train you up for his purposes. And that is what Joseph acknowledges. That is what Joseph is understanding. All of the trials and the patience, all of the prayers that he had to pray, all of the waiting and the relying upon God, that is what he needed. And so when the time came, when he did have to step up and be second in command in front of all these masses, and if he fails, he's not just getting fired. If he fails in his duty, what happens to the entire nation? They're all gonna die. That's a heavy responsibility. And so God has been preparing Joseph step by step, every step of the way, to rely upon him. I will bless you. I'm going to bless you. Whatever you do, I'm going to bless you and bless you. Rely upon me. Trust in me that whatever you do is going to succeed. Don't be afraid to fail. And so that's what happens. God taught him patience. God taught him humility. Do you know how humiliating it is to no longer have, independence? That you are no longer considered a person yourself, but you are an object that belongs to another, subject to the whims of another, because that's what he became as a slave. God taught him reliance. And in all of these things, Joseph credited it all back to God. He understood that this was God's blessing unto him. And in his work, what do you think? Did God bless him? If you follow the rhythm of the passage, absolutely. If you look at Genesis 41, verse 49, it's very, very clear. Look at Genesis chapter 41, verse 49. It says, "And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured." So when God was saying 7 years of plentiful harvest, he meant 7 years of plentiful harvest times however much God is going to bless Joseph, because they stopped measuring how much grain that they were storing up because it was just so much, they just couldn't measure it all. All this, all that suffering, all that injustice was to allow him the experience to put him in the right place at the right time with the right skills and the reliance upon God, so that Joseph might save the nations. So that hundreds of thousands would not starve to death. I don't know how much you guys watch Netflix. I know a lot, probably more than me. But one of my favorite shows is, I love the wilderness kind of shows. So Alone is one on Netflix, and a new season I think just came out, and I watched it. And if you know the premise of Alone, it's they scatter these mountaineering people in the wilderness, and they have to survive on their own by themselves for as long as possible, and whoever lasts the longest wins $500,000. But what's the same across the board is that as time progresses, as food dwindles from summer or like late summer to like winter in this last one, food sources become rarer, harder to find, and people are slowly starving to death. They're starving. And the show will pull you out before you actually, endanger yourself. They'll weigh you and do medical checkups, but you can see what it does to the mind and the body if you don't have food. Just going to the restroom and coming back is an exhausting process. If you don't have food, slowly starving to death. Can you imagine slowly starving to death? In our day and age, it's hard to imagine, but slowly starving to death because of famine, because nothing is going to grow. And not just for 1 year. Maybe you could hold out for 1 year. But these people probably don't know how long the famine is going to last. 2 years? Food runs out. 3 years? 4 years? With all the food in your pantry, if you can't purchase any more, how long are you going to last until starvation sets in? Joseph is understanding that his purpose in God's work is to ensure that the nation of Egypt, but also the other nations around Egypt, do not starve, do not perish. He understands that is his purpose. But that isn't the only reason. That's not the only reason. There's actually an even greater reason. What you have to understand with Joseph is that in God's redemptive plan, Joseph is not the chosen son. Do you know that? This story is all about Joseph. Several chapters, starting in chapter 40. It goes all the way to chapter 50. It's all about Joseph, but the chosen son is not Joseph. His father chose Joseph. His father favored Joseph. Through Abraham and through his descendants, we're eventually going to come to King David. And after King David, we're going to go all the way to Jesus. We're looking at this bloodline, this lineage. Joseph is not God's chosen son through whom Jesus comes. Do you understand that? That's really important. Who is it then? Who does Joseph come from, or Jesus come from? Do you remember? Judah. Judah. That's why, if you look in Genesis, that's why you have the story of Joseph. You know, it starts in chapter 37, story of Joseph continues all the way to chapter 50, but then right in chapter 38, you have an interruption in the story, and it makes absolutely no sense. Suddenly you have Judah and Tamar. They make a entrance, and you're like, what? Why? Okay, and then it goes back to Joseph. And that's a very, very intentional interruption that Moses put in, because he wants you to understand, even though this story focuses on Joseph, Joseph is not the son. Judah is the chosen son through whom Jesus is going to eventually come. But Judah is not a good man. But if you, and we're not going to get into it today, but if you read chapter 38, Judah, through his mistake, comes to understand that he is a sinful man and he is not righteous. And so he changes his life. And so, if you look at the later passages, it is Judah who takes charge, and Judah who ensures and places his father and calms Joseph down when he's angry. That's why you have this interruption. Because it is Judah who is the important one. So what is Joseph's role? The second part, it's not just saving the nations, although that is supremely important. It is ensuring that the line of David remains alive. Do you understand? The famine wasn't just in Egypt. The famine was also in the land of Canaan. Year 1, they're out of food. They come to Egypt to purchase food. And Joseph sees his brothers, recognizes them, and he finally understands, oh, it's not just the nations. Because up until this time, he's tried to forget his family. That's what he named his son. You know, you have allowed me to forget my past family. He wants to forget, but the hurt is still there. The betrayal is still there. He understands, oh, it's not just the other people. It's not just this nation that I have adopted that I'm going to save. God sent me here to save even my own family, the father that I love and the brothers that I have resented. So what does he do? What does he do? What is the first thing, do you think, that went through Joseph's head when he saw his brothers? The Bible actually tells us. The Bible actually tells us. It says that it's the dream. Moses intentionally puts a reference to the dream right when he sees his brothers. Remember his dream when he was young? A dream that he probably resented as he spent years in prison. Who's going to bow to a prisoner? A slave? His brothers didn't bow down to him. They sold him off. He hasn't seen his parent or his father in years. Who's going to bow down to him? No one. But in this moment, when he sees his brothers lined up to purchase grain for him, and they have to purchase it directly from him, they bow down to him. And he remembers that dream and understands, oh, this was God's purpose in my life. But he can't just leave it alone, because there's betrayal and hurt there. And so he tests his brothers. He tests them two times. So what's the first test? Do you know? The first test is in chapter 42. And what he does is he wants to see if they had changed. He had changed. He himself had changed. Yes, the resentment and the anger is there, but he sees now that this was God's purpose in his life. So he's most of the way there to forgiveness. But he wants to see if they had changed. Did they remember me? Did they regret their actions? Or are they just happy-go-lucky in their lives and they have forgotten about him? So he accuses them of being spies. Asks them lots of pointed questions about their family. Demands that they bring their youngest to him to confirm that they aren't lying. And although he gives them food, he also sends the money back and keeps one of the brothers as collateral, right? Simeon is kept with him. What does that look like to an outsider? That the brothers get all the food, they also don't pay anything, and leave a brother behind. What does that look like? They sold off the brother. That's what it's supposed to look like. He's testing them. Are they really gonna leave him here? How long are they gonna leave him here? Are they gonna forget about him? Are they ever gonna come back? He's testing them to see. They leave, and eventually the food that they purchased runs out, and they have to come back. It's now year 2 of the famine. They have to come back, but the brothers are afraid because they remembered his pointed questions. One of their brothers is still captive in Egypt. They have to bring the youngest. If they don't bring the youngest, they're not going to get any food. They're probably also going to be killed. And so, Judah finally coaxes his father into letting the youngest child, remember, their father, Jacob, loved his wife Rebecca, right? And she had 2 sons. And he favors them above all the others. The firstborn is presumed dead. And so how much do you think the youngest son, Benjamin, has been clung on to? Father probably does not let him out of his sight. And they have to convince his father to let this child go, young man go, to Egypt. Because that's the only way that they're going to get food. But Judah is able to convince him, plead with him. And so they come back. And when they come back, he is tested. The brothers are tested again. Everyone's united. All the brothers are there. Simeon is released. And they're all in Jacob's house. And they're having a feast. And, they have a good time. And he gives them all the food that they can carry. He doesn't take their money, but also he adds a little something. A silver cup, his own personal cup, and has a servant sneak it into Benjamin's bag. This is the final test. Would they abandon their brother? Would they sell him out for their own lives? So he lets them go a little while, and then he has his men follow them, stop them, and demand, "Why have you repaid good for evil? I was so gracious to you. I hosted you. I fed you. I gave you all this food. I didn't even take your money. And you steal from me?" And the brothers are like, "We didn't steal. We're honest. We didn't steal anything. If any one of us did steal anything, you can kill that person. Because we are honest, nobody stole." And so they begin searching bags, starting with the oldest. What happens when we get to Benjamin, the youngest? Cup. And what do you think the brothers are doing? Oh, they cannot return home without the youngest. Their father will just straight up just die. They can't return home. So everyone packs up and goes back to Joseph. And that's what he wanted. I am so lost. But, okay, hold on.
Take the time.
He wants to see if they had genuinely changed. And so they return, and what happens? What happens? Judah pleads. His brother, Judah, pleads with Joseph, asking for forgiveness, but also offering himself as exchange. Very different than the brothers who sold him off, who were so angry at him they were willing to kill him. And instead, let's make a little bit of profit. Let's sell him off instead of killing him, because killing him doesn't get us anything. But if we sell him, we get a little bit of money, right? So instead of just, leaving their brother and be like, we had nothing to do with him whatever you want, we will leave, they plead and they beg, especially Judah. And what is Joseph's response? When he finally sees the way his brothers had changed their actions, if you turn to Genesis 45, I'm going to read verses 1 through 9. Then Joseph could not control himself. Now, as an aside, throughout this entire saga, Joseph cries constantly. He weeps all the time. He is so emotional because this is an old hurt. This was betrayal, but it's finally being resolved. Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, "Make everyone go out from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud and said, he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it. I mean, everyone has gone out from his presence, but he's crying and he's so loud that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. So Joseph said to his brothers, "Come near to me, please." And they came to him. They came near, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt." Remember the shock. What? You're not dead? You're alive? And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me here before you to preserve life. Do you think Joseph had forgiven his brothers? Absolutely. Absolutely. He was already halfway there. He had forgiven them. He just wanted to see if they really regretted. But he had forgiven them. And he now understood that all the suffering, sure, his brothers did it because they hated him. But all of it worked out for the good of God's plan. And he was content with that knowledge. Verse 6, "For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve you a remnant on earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God." Do you understand the depth of his forgiveness for him to say this? And to not feel resentment? "He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry up, go to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not tarry.'" So all that hardship, all that injustice, all that suffering, all the humiliation that he had to suffer, there was a purpose. God had a reason, a good one, and it was to preserve life. Not just the life of all the nations, but to ensure that the line of Abraham, the line of David, would not die out. And that they would continue to grow into a great nation. Remember the promise God made to Abraham. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will bless your descendants. All the nations of the earth will be blessed through you. And this is God upholding his word. They're not a great nation yet. They're still a small group of people. And yes, they are wealthy, but not like powerful. They are in danger of dying, and this is God preserving the line of Abraham. And did you know that this is also confirmed by what God says in Genesis 46? If you look at verse 3, God reveals himself and says, I am God, the God of your father. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will also bring you up again, and Joseph's hand will close your eyes. So this is God revealing himself to Joseph's father, Jacob, and saying, go to Egypt. I'm going to be with you. And it is in Egypt that I'm going to make you a great nation. This is God setting the stage for the next great redemptive work, which happens to Egypt, which is the setting is in Egypt with Moses. This is God getting all the pieces ready so that Israel becomes a great nation. This is God drawing everything in to set the stage for the next phase of his plan. And even though he's all powerful, he's also merciful and loving and kind. And he repeatedly shows us that he is loving and kind. Instead of just letting us suffer and just suffer for the sake of suffering, he doesn't do that. The Bible doesn't say God likes to watch us suffer. Instead, the Bible teaches us that God is kind and his mercies abound. Do you know what God says about himself? God says about himself in Exodus 34. This is God talking about himself and his character. God says, the Lord, a God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. Our God is just. He will not just let us get away with sin, but he is merciful and gracious and slow to anger. He loves you. So instead of just allowing us to suffer for no reason, there is a point to our suffering. That when we do suffer, there is a reason. He transforms it into something worthwhile. So instead of Joseph just suffering because his brothers hated him, there was a reason he suffered. Joseph's brothers fear his retaliation after their father's death, right? That's the passage we read earlier. That after their father dies, the brothers are afraid again. They think Joseph is going to retaliate because they don't understand that Joseph has forgiven them. How could anyone forgive what they have done? But Joseph had forgiven them. And so what does Joseph say to them once again? Do not fear. For am I in the place of God? As for you, he's saying, I'm not your judge. God is judge. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones. Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. And isn't this exactly what Paul tells us in Romans? In Romans 8:28, Paul says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good." Even your bad day, even your failures, even when people make you fail, even when people come up against you, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. God is going to take all of your suffering and make it good. It's going to be for a purpose. When God has called you to his purpose, nothing that anyone can do can separate you from the love that God is going to show you. All the evil thrown at you, all the hatred, in the end, it will be used to further the purpose of God. Do you understand how wonderful that is?
Amen.
So yes, Joseph suffered. But in the end, he saw God's hand at work. And through his suffering, through his dependence on God, he was in the right place at the right time with the right skills to save the nations. To continue the line of Abraham. Now, before I end, I want to show you kind of the big picture. So from the story, we learned that our suffering has a purpose. We don't just suffer for no reason, but God will use it for his purposes. Sometimes even when we don't understand. But God is going to use it. But there's another thing that the Bible is doing. And what I want you to see is that there are repeating themes, there are repeating similar circumstances, motifs that echo in the Old Testament. And as you progress in the storyline, those things, those repetitions, get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so their meaning gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And at the end, you ultimately have the climax at Jesus Christ. What you see here is this, that although Joseph is a man and he's a sinner just like us, he is a Christ-like figure. That the Old Testament is using Joseph and giving us a foreshadowing of what is to come. Can you think of any similarities between Joseph and Christ? Give yourself a moment to think. What are some similarities that you think? Because there are so many, and I can't explain all of them. The whole story is about saving the nations, saving people from death, right? And isn't that what Jesus did? Saving us sinners from eternal damnation. So there's that similarity. But look at it this way. They are both the subject of a father's special love, right? They are both sold for pieces of silver. They are both stripped of their robes. They both go into Egypt. Jesus when he was young, but they both travel down to Egypt and come back again. They are both falsely accused. Joseph is falsely accused of sleeping with his master's wife. Jesus is accused of so many things, of blasphemy. But despite all the accusations, they are faithful despite the temptation to lie, despite the temptation to sin. They resist. They are both thrown into prison. They are both placed with two prisoners, one which dies and one which is lifted high, right? With Jesus, two thieves, one of them, Jesus says, "You will be with me in paradise." Do you remember that? They both were publicly acknowledged at 30 years of age. Jesus began his ministry when he was 30. Joseph stood before Pharaoh when he was 30. They both stood before the rulers, Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and then all the Roman leaders and rulers, whereas Joseph stood before Pharaoh. Both are exalted only after they go through suffering and humiliation. Both forgave those who sinned against him. Joseph forgave his brothers. Jesus, remember Christ's last words? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, when Christ was on the cross. Through them, all the nations were blessed. What I didn't mention in the story is that when Joseph has his father come up, his father comes up, meets with Pharaoh, and blesses Pharaoh. Now this is really interesting, because when you have an older person and a younger person, who usually does the blessing? Does the young kid say, "Hey, pastor, I bless you"? The one who is greater blesses the one who is lesser. We don't bless God, God blesses us, right? Who blesses Pharaoh? Jacob blesses Pharaoh. That is so true. Through you, the nations on the earth will be blessed is the promise that God made to Abraham, right? And so this is being fulfilled because the family of Abraham are now living in Egypt. They multiply, and because of Joseph, Egypt becomes rich. They become so rich. Because of this famine, the people who don't have food first give all their money, and then they don't have anything else to give, so they give all their livestock, and then they give all their land, and now they don't have anything left to give, so what do? They give themselves. Through this famine, Egypt becomes so incredibly rich. This is God blessing the land of Egypt. Why? Because his chosen people are residing in the land. So it is through them, through Jesus Christ, whom all the nations are blessed. And it is through both of them that people are saved from death. That is the point of the story, right? He saved them from starvation. Jesus saves us from a worse death, which saves us from sin. And we may not understand all the things, but for them, for both of them, while men plotted against them, for Joseph it's his brothers and Potiphar's wife, and for Jesus, it's the Sanhedrin, the teachers of the law, the scribes and the Pharisees, and all those people who are plotting to kill him. God used evil for good. God used that for good. We don't usually question things when things are good, but we do question things when things are bad. And what we need to know is that the Lord is in control. When you are suffering, God is still in control. There's a reason for your suffering. You may not understand it. And if you're somebody like Job, you will never understand it. But God is in control, and God will use your suffering for the good. It is all in his hands. And that's what I want you to learn from this passage in the Bible, the story of Joseph. So knowing that God uses our suffering for his good, that's the lesson. But also understanding and seeing the echoes of Jesus Christ that can be found in the Old Testament, and anticipating in the story of what is coming, of the greater one that is coming. Joseph is a great figure, but there's coming someone who is greater than he, who will save us even in a greater way. And that is the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the chance to dive deeper into the story of Joseph. Help us to see that not all suffering is punishment. And despite the things that we may have to endure, you, Lord, will ensure all things work together for good. For you are sovereign, and you have a plan not just for our lives, but the lives of every person and nation. Lord, help us to not become bitter, but to entrust ourselves into your hands. To know that our suffering is for a reason. May our faith glorify you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.